Present-day American patriots might be hard-pressed to label anyone a super patriot. But more than 40 years ago, right along the Treasure Coast in Stuart, there did live an authentic super patriot. His contributions as a military veteran, a journalist, and volunteer were numerous over his very long lifespan. This hometown super patriot was Stuart's own Captain Francis Alexander Adams. Right at the gateway to downtown Stuart is a small park across from Confusion Corner. A majestic United States flag flies from a tall pole in the park. At the base of the pole is a small plaque dedicating the park to Stuart's celebrity, Captain Francis Adams. This honor was bestowed on Adams to also mark his 100th anniversary birth on May 11, 1974, and for his exercise of good government in Stuart community by his own personal efforts. His life began in New York City on May 11, 1874. The area was called Long Acre Square in Manhattan. Later in 1904, that same area becomes known as Times Square. The Adams family dated back to the 1700s. His father was John Quincy Adams, named after the former president, but not a direct relative. Related instead to Samuel Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, who was related to the father, John Quincy Adams. Young Francis attended public schools in New York City, then went to the College of the City of New York, and finally law school at the University of New York in 1897. His aunt was Flora Adams Darling of the well-known nationally DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, and also Daughters of 1812. He assisted his aunt as a young man in the 1890s by publishing articles in the family magazine, Adams Magazine, about this new organization. Francis's father, John Q. Adams, was also involved in publishing in New York. John was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution since its beginning in the 1890s. Their ancestor was Andrew Adams from Massachusetts, who was an officer during the American Revolutionary War. Lieutenant Andrew Adams was born August 12, 1735. John's son, Francis, joins that same organization with his father in 1918. In 1897, young Francis joined the New York National Guard, known as the Rainbow Division. His battery was eventually sent to Fort Hamilton in New York, and then he was transferred to Company M of the 14th New York Volunteer Infantry, Company M, at the outbreak of the war in 1898. The end of the 1890s saw the sinking of the USS Maine on February 15, 1898, and this contributed to the outbreak of the Spanish-American War by April. The United States was fighting the control of Cuba by Spain. Adams trained in Tampa, Florida, under Colonel Frederick D. Grant, who was the son of U.S. Grant. Adams served as the Colonel Grant's liaison officer and made second lieutenant. Adams was then sent to Cuba. He came in contact with Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders as they fought against the Spanish during the war. He was also part of the group that charged San Juan Hill, but he walked it. The war went from April 21st to 1898 to August 13, 1898. 385 Americans killed in battle, thousands wounded, and 2,000 died from diseases. Adams came down with typhoid fever after returning to the United States in September 1898, but he survived and was able to return to his New York home. In 1900, he and his father were publishers. Francis worked for the New York Evening Journal as a journalist, then in 1903 became editor of the New York Commercial, a daily newspaper. By the early 1900s and into the 1910s, Francis had written several different books covering topics like Theodore Roosevelt, the federal government, and big economic trusts. Some of these books were Who Rules America?, Transgressors, Theodore Roosevelt, and the American Minutemen of Today. Adams was with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, December 17, 1903. Later, he even got the opportunity to fly with them. Frances married by 1905 to Minnie W. Joles, born 1875 in Virginia. This was her second marriage, but first for Francis. And he also continued to work for the New York commercial newspaper that dealt especially with the textile industry in New York. His mother, Mary, died in March 1907, and his father in 1911. In September 1908, Francis ran for the legislative seat in Congress as a Republican representing the cotton, wool, silk, and retail trades, but was defeated in that election. By 1910, he was becoming, though, a well-known journalist across the country. With 1917, the United States entered the Great War, and at age 43, Francis joined the U.S. Army again and was assigned to the company commander of Company N of the 22nd Regiment. With the Motor Transport Corps and the military intelligence, he served under General John J. Pershing. Francis was discharged from the military then, March 1919. After World War I, Francis became active in a new patriotic organization, this known as the Minutemen of America, serving as their chief officer for years. This group participated in every veteran and patriotic parade, fundraiser, gathering across the country with their many branches. Their whole purpose was to sponsor a feeling of patriotism in Americans. Francis and his wife Minnie divorced in the early 1920s. By 1925, Francis married, again this time to Mary Gertrude, known as Trude, Barton, who was born April 1879 in Pennsylvania. January 1929, Francis traveled to Miami and then boarded a ship back to Cuba for a visit this time. During the 1930s, he worked to preserve the Betsy Ross House, located at 239 Arch Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It had been already open to the public since 1898, originally built in 1740, with many other families who have lived there besides Betsy Ross and her husband John, who lived there from 1773 to 1786. Adams became a charter member of the Betsy Ross Memorial Association. During World War II in the 1940s, at the age of 68, Francis became a captain in the Aviation Recruiting Service and served under General Eisenhower. So after decades in New York and 3 military conflicts, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Adams was now drawn to Stuart, Florida. In 1948, at the age of 74 years old, he was helping to bring Grumman Aircraft Corporation to Stuart, planning to lease Witham Field. That company was accomplished and had flourished for decades in New York. Grumman started back in 1929 and were known for building aircraft parts and equipment, search and navigation equipment. He moved permanently to Stuart in 1948 with his second wife, Mary. They lived at 935 Riverside Drive in Hildebred Park. Adams became involved in all local flag, memorial, and Veterans Day programs immediately. Adams became very active in civic and charitable organizations throughout Martin County, especially those concerning veterans. In September 1953, Ralph Johnson and Captain Francis Adams were appointed the 1954 chairman for the Red Cross Fund Drive. He helped increase Red Cross membership and raise monies tremendously over the next several years. Always looking into new ideas and concepts for Stuart, in 1956, Adams suggested to the city that a helicopter bilingual school and a helicopter port be built for Stuart, to be very close to the airport and fairgrounds. He worked with the National Association of Aviation Industrialists to have a helicopter port built. They were willing to do it. The city was behind the idea, but getting a suitable helicopter company then to eventually come into the area proved very difficult. It never was activated. By 1958, The new bridges going from Stuart to Hutchinson Island were to be dedicated, and it was Captain Adams who was named the chairman of the Citizens Committee for the bridge dedication, and that started work on November 1957. The Evans Prairie Bridge and the Ernie Lyons Bridge, which ran west to east, east to west, were originally first called 10-cent bridge and 25-cent bridge because of the tolls. April 1959, Captain Adams was one of the speakers at the big dedication of the new U.S. Post Office on West 7th Street, now known as Martin Luther King Boulevard. His second wife died in June 1960, and from both of his marriage he never had any children. Adams continued during the 1960s, being very active at Stuart City Hall meetings and as a guest speaker at many civic organizations. He lived during the 1960s in the Atlantic Park Apartments at East Ocean Boulevard, very close to Stuart Middle School. In 1970, he suggested a non-traffic mall to be placed in downtown Stuart. The idea was to improve storefronts and attract more customers downtown. It was, though, unfortunately not approved by City Hall. It would actually be years before major renovations really improved the downtown Stuart area. He was always a very popular speaker over the years. He'd quote from Shakespeare, or he'd tell stories of his many adventures over the last 70 years. He spoke about also respecting Americans' veterans, and especially the U.S. flag. He was well known for handing out small flags to people and having one always in his coat jacket. He eventually became known as Martin County's flag man. He said, "I've enjoyed every minute of my life." When he could no longer safely drive a car at age 95, he would be seen waving a hanky to hitch a ride from passing vehicles along East Ocean, and especially getting a ride from the Stuart police officers. He ate his meals at the Stuart Holiday Inn on US 1, had his own table and booth, and he loved to finish his dinner with a Manhattan cocktail. But he could walk, as he did especially for any of the Stuart parades, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and the 4th of July. It was May 28, 1972. Adams developed a museum for the city of Stuart at the age of 98. He had the use of a small cottage with 3 small rooms in it on East 7th Street, behind where the Stuart Police and Ambulance was located at that time. He named it Museum of the City of Stuart. He had collected 300,000 pieces of memorabilia to add to this new museum, all of it approved by the city mayor and the city commission. He worked on that project every day. October 1972, he was named the chairman of the United Nations Day celebration for Martin County. In December 1973, Adams suffered a minor stroke, spent a short time in the hospital, and then was released. But he had this advice at age 99. Don't get sick and don't take medicine. Plus, it's a good idea to stay away from doctors. He was still continuing making suggestions for Stuart. In January of 1974, he thought there should be some major docks built, or even a port of entry. The idea did not stay very well with the commissioners, but he was always trying. He was also still very active with the local DAR organization. He was asked for May 1974 to open up the Sailfish Regatta, and of course with a U.S. flag in hand. The city of Stuart marked Captain Adams' 100th birthday on May 11 with several parties and a special dedication by the city. Adams was one of the most active, concerned citizens of Stuart, always continuing the challenge of good citizenship. A park by Confucian Corner was dedicated to Captain Adams for his exercise of good government by his own personal efforts. This was named the Captain Adams Park because it was his gateway to downtown Stuart. Also, the flagpole at the new City Hall was dedicated in his honor. He was referred to happily as the George Washington of Stuart, an original patriot, a man of the people. For his birthday, he was honored by 14 different civic organizations throughout the county. He was, at 100 years old, the oldest licensed associate in the real estate business in the United States. He was especially looking forward to America's bicentennial in July 1976. He was even asked to lead the Pledge of Allegiance on July 4th in Philadelphia for the bicentennial. Suffering some medical setbacks, a hip injury and some falls in mid-1975 almost became too much for Captain Adams, and he died at the age of 101 on September 24th, 1975, not making the bicentennial the next year. To mark his passing, flags were flown at City Hall and throughout Martin County at half-mast. His service was at St. Mary's Episcopal Church and burial with full military honors at All Saints Church in Jensen Beach. The Martin County High School students in October 1975 dedicated their homecoming parade and the football game in his honor. Captain Adams was one of the last survivors of the Spanish-American War as of 1975. His collection of Stuart memorabilia later becomes part of the Stuart Heritage Museum, which is at the old feed store right on Flagler Avenue. Adams was Stuart's own remarkable U.S. veteran and super patriot.